Hi, I'm Teresa Coenen with Stitch and Tree Quilts, and this is month 3, our block 8 of our COVID Friends Tribute Quilt. Block 8 is a block that I've called oppression, and I use an anvil block to indicate that it's the anvil of oppression. I created this block because in May of 2020, George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, and it sparked the Black Lives Matters movement, many riots, and many protests across the country. After his death, there have been other deaths that have come to the forefront in our media, television news, social media, online, and this has really become a very large movement. While directly not related to COVID, it is related in as such as during this time of pandemic, people are frustrated and they're acting out in ways that they might not normally act out. Let's take a look at the pattern. On page 1 of the pattern, I have the cutting instructions that show the 2 different fabrics, and we'll talk about fabric choices in a minute. I also include information about the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis and why the racial oppression that's been going on in the United States seems to have hit kind of a boiling point in our nation at this time. I also talk about the disparity, including the COVID crisis, disparity between white Americans and Americans of color. On page 2 of the pattern, I go over the instructions, including the pressing instructions. There's a couple of tricky parts in the pattern. I'll go over those on the video today, and you'll want to make note on your pattern so that you don't make a common error that's very easy to make. On page 3, I talk about the block known as the anvil block and why I chose it to represent oppression. And I include a space for you to write your own personal reflection related to racial oppression or discrimination in the United States, or just reflect on what you've observed or how you feel when you see the protests and the riots on the media. Let's take a look at some fabric choices. In my bright basics and blenders, I chose a black background that has some bright dots to it so that I would choose that black very purposely for Black Lives Matters. And I chose 2 fabrics that, even though one is black and the other is a fabric of color, they're pretty complementary as far as value goes. In my deep and rich blenders, I chose a fabric that has a swirl to it that kind of indicates the angst and the chaos that are going on in our country at this time. Again, the fabrics for both the outside edges of my anvil and the center have a pretty similar value. For my bright batiks with a black background, I chose a fabric for the center. I don't know if you can see that it has faces on it. It actually happens to be cat faces, but it has faces. And I thought that was a good representation of all the people whose lives have been impacted much more directly by this than mine has. And today, for the sample that I'm going to make for the video, it's for my deep and rich batiks. And I have chosen this fabric with the swirls and a brown to go with that, with my off-white background. Now with these fabrics, you can choose a fabric that's directional for the center of your anvil. Very easily, you can choose a directional fabric. You could choose to fussy cut a fabric. On your half square units, you can choose a directional half square, but just remember that for every half square, for every square that you cut in half diagonally, there's a left and a right side to it. So you're going to want to be cautious as about how you place those on the sides of your anvil so that they go in the direction that you want them to go. Let's dig in for the first instruction. The first instruction has you very simply adding your half square units, stitching them together, your background plus your fabric 1 half squares, and you're going to stitch those and press those towards the background units. Now you have more fabric 1 half squares than what you have backgrounds, and that's purposeful. You're going to need that for step 2. I like to engineer the corners of my half square units so that I don't end up with dog ears. I use a Marty Michelle template that will allow me to engineer those corners off so that they end up pressing very easily into just nice, neat squares. You don't have to do that. You can always trim your dog ears off as you go. Go ahead and make 4 of the half square triangles and we'll press towards the background fabric. I like to chain piece. I find that helps me to go quicker through my process, saves time and saves thread. I have a block in my machine and it happens to be one of my 9-patch units. I like to use those for beginners and enders. Because I'm not using a directional fabric, I don't have to be overly cautious as to how I place these half squares together when running them through my machine at 1/4 inch. Like I said, I like to chain piece these. It makes it go much faster. To close out that chain, I just take another block from my 9-patch pile and run that through as an ender. Then I can snip my chain off and break them apart. When I'm chain piecing, I like to use my chain ripper. It sits in a base. It's just a simple seam ripper next to my machine. And even when my chains are only 1 thread apart, I can easily pop those units apart quite simply. When I'm done, I take my ripper, turn it so the sharp side's in, and it can just sit on my sewing table and I know where to find that at any time. The pattern calls for you to press to the background fabric. So I'm going to do that by first setting my seam, setting a hot iron on it with no steam. I don't like to use steam in these small pieces. Steam will always introduce stretch. So a nice hot iron, set the seam, and then press it open again by holding for 5 seconds. Your unfinished unit should measure 2 inches. So it's a good opportunity for you to measure that and see if you have to straighten that up or square that up in any way. I'll show you a simple square up tip as soon as I finish pressing. When looking to square up your units, you can use any square, any ruler that has a diagonal that comes into the point. And you will lay that diagonal right on your seam, and then you'll look at your 2-inch line and see if there's any adjustments that you might need to make. And in this case, I've got that little dog ear. I could go ahead and just trim that off. That's about all I need to do with that piece. So if there is a problem with your unit, it needs to measure up to 2 inches square. If there is a problem with your unit, now's the time to check that and see if there's anything that you need to do to make an adjustment. Remember, you're always going to keep that diagonal line on the diagonal of the half square itself. If you're working with a perfectly square half square, it will make the next part of the instructions go much easier. Step 2 has a tricky part. It has a left and a right. So in step 2, I find that the easiest way to get it right is to lay my units out exactly as they are shown here in the picture. So you can see I have these 2 units laid out exactly as they're shown in the picture. After I have these 2 units laid out, I'm adding another half square triangle exactly as the picture shows. And the pattern calls for you to make 2 of each item. So I'm going to lay a second unit directly on top of it. And this way I am less likely to make a mistake. So a second unit here and a second unit here. That being said, I'm ready to take these to my machine to stitch them. So I'm going to just fold this half square over onto top of this one, matching that right angle. And again, I have my units engineered so I don't have an overlap. But if your corners are not engineered, you will have roughly 3/8 of an inch of overlap. And you can run these through your machine, sewing from the right angle towards the point. The second half of step 2 indicates that you should be pressing to that open half square. So once again, we'll set that seam with our nice hot iron with no steam. Open this up, finger press it, and make sure that when you're pressing, you've got a nice straight line here. Hold that in place for 5 seconds. Step 3 calls for you to take 2 of these pieces and stitch them onto 2 opposite sides. The pieces that you're going to choose are going to be the ones that I say point to the left. I'll line that one up here. I'll line this one up there. I'm going to make sure it looks exactly like the picture before I begin sewing. As far as sewing, again, I have engineered corners, so mine aren't going to overlap, but yours will overlap slightly, 3/8 of an inch. You will flip this over like a sandwich and line up those right angles, stitching from the right angle down and through the point. You can check to make sure that you're following right through where that half square meets the seam here so that you make sure you catch those points quite nicely. In order to do that, if you choose, you could put a pin in that. The second half of step 3 calls for you to press to the outside. This is going to seem awkward because you typically would press your half squares towards this flat piece of fabric here that doesn't have any seams. But you need to press to the outside so that the next steps of this unit will flow together nicely. So it's very important to set that seam, open it up to finger press it, and just set that iron on the seam and let it do your work. This is where I really like to have this nice wool mat that takes the depth of that seam, and so it makes it so that it never gets a shiny surface right there where those points are coming to a point there. That's a lot of bulk in that area, and what the mat does is it absorbs that bulk as I'm pressing. So again, I'll turn the unit over so I'm pressing this other side exactly like I pressed the first side. I'll set that seam. And then I'll go ahead and just set the iron on for a good 5 seconds. I'm ready for the next step. In step 4, we're taking the remaining units and we're adding squares to the bottom of the units. And then we'll press again towards that half square triangle. In pressing again, you put the part that you want to press towards at the top, set the seam, and then press that open. Again, this is going to seem awkward because you're pressing away from that simple piece of fabric and you're pressing towards a half square. But again, you also want to make sure you're keeping that unit nice and straight. In step 5, you will use the units from step 4, and you'll be matching this seam, which should nest quite nicely. Make a sandwich, nest that seam, and you'll be stitching from the top to the point. This point will overlap roughly 3/8 of an inch unless you have engineered your corners. Now, before stitching that, I'm going to pin that seam, and I have 2 different methods that I can use. I can use a fork pin, which is a true prong pin that easily can go on both sides of the seam, holding it in place to keep it from scooting. Or I can use a traditional pin. And if I use a traditional pin, once I nest those seams, I always pin on the uphill side of the seam. That will keep that seam from scooching down as I'm stitching. I'll show video of both pinning methods as I'm stitching these units. This first unit is stitched with a traditional pin set in place. And as I get to the pin, once I have my needle through that seam allowance, I remove the pin. Once again, using my 9-patch units as beginners and enders. This half of my unit has the fork pin in place. I'll stitch that 1/4-inch seam until I get to that uphill side. Remove my fork pin and stitch through to the end of the seam. In step 6, you're going to take the 2 half square pieces and you are going to stitch them to the edges of the unit. In order to find the center of the half square, you can use the pinch method as we've used before. I have engineered corners, so my half squares match up perfectly on the edges. Otherwise, you're going to overlap roughly 3/8 of an inch. I recommend stitching from the back side so you can stitch directly through the point and you can see exactly where you want to stitch that half square through so you catch that point perfectly. The second half of step 6 calls for you to set that seam and press it to the outside. And I always recommend edge stitching around the edge of that block 1/8 of an inch so the block stays nice and square if you're going to be manipulating it quite a bit throughout the rest of our COVID tribute quilt. Well, that is block 8 of our COVID Friends Tribute Quilt, Oppression, the Anvil of Oppression. I thank you for joining me today. If you have any questions along the way, give me a call, send me an email, or post a question to our group on the Facebook page. All the contact information will be at the end of this video. Thank you and have a blessed day.